What is going on, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is Brian and myself, episode 166, and we are discussing current topics in the evidence-based scene. Now, a bit of a caveat that Brian and I would like to put on the front of this episode is we are not going to be digging into the research specifically on this episode like we do in some other prior episodes, but we are really just going to have a higher level discussion and include some of our own opinions, which may differ, right? Again, fully transparent about just some of the high level things in the space that we have been seeing more commonly and recently. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of today's topic, as always, Brian, can you kick us off with some updates, please?
Yeah, that was a perfect intro. That's exactly the way I'd frame it too. Just kind of having a conversation about some topics that seem to be sparking some interest in the industry right now. So hopefully you guys find that helpful. I have 3 updates today, so I'll be quick. First one is we just had a huge birthday bonanza the last week. I turned 42, and then my son actually turned 7 in early September, but he really wanted a pool party, and the pools here stop allowing parties to occur after Labor Day. So we just decided to do his party this prior weekend as well. So he turned 7, I guess 2 weeks before he actually turned 7. Super fun. Got to do that. For my birthday, we tried to go out to eat as a family on Wednesday to a restaurant downtown here in Boulder. And the kids were like just epically awful. I mean, I don't know that they've been this bad at a dinner in like a year. And we took them out and like the whole thing was just miserable, like trying to entertain them, not getting sat initially, having a 15-minute wait, them throwing a fit, getting sat, throwing a fit again, not liking the food, throwing another fit. It was basically a pretty miserable birthday dinner out for me. So Kim and I went and had like a proper date night out where we got like steak and potatoes and all that good stuff. A few days later, and then we had Bryson's party the next day. So big kind of social hangout, lots of birthdays, all that good stuff. But more interesting than that, some buddies and I, so me and 3 other guys, decided to bike Rollins Pass on Sunday. So like 2 days prior to recording this. And Rollins Pass is call it an ATV or Jeep road. It's basically double track. Where you could fit like, an off-road vehicle of some sort or bikes like we're doing. And it basically starts at 9,200 feet by this tunnel called the Moffett Tunnel here in Colorado. It's about an hour from Boulder. And you kind of meander and wind up this mountain. And you literally just climb for the first 2,300 feet of vertical. So we're starting at 9,200 feet, which is already pretty high, almost 2 miles up. And then we're climbing up to 11,500 feet, which is over 2 miles up. And I've never biked in super thin air like that before. So it was something I was really looking forward to, especially as if you guys have listened to any of our prior Instagram Q&As, there's always questions about when I'm going to do Leadville. And we've talked about Leadville being this like high altitude mountain biking race here in Colorado that goes up to 12,500 feet. And I was always so nervous about this idea of biking at extreme elevation, thinking that the air was going to be so thin and I wasn't going to be able to breathe and all that stuff. And yes, at 11,500, the air was a bit thinner. It was a bit harder to breathe, but I was surprised at how it didn't affect me as much as I thought it would have affected me. And I was still able to press on the pedals and continue climbing and continue biking even at 11,500 feet. So that was just a really cool experience. The whole ride took 3.5 hours. It took us about 2 hours to get up. And then we kind of chilled at the top a little bit, slowly meandered down, and then bombed it down once we got about halfway and the terrain kind of chilled out a little bit. But a really cool experience, something that I think I'll probably do again if and when Leadville becomes a real opportunity. A couple of the other guys on the trip with us also want to do Leadville. And so they were saying 2025. I think 2026 might be a more realistic endeavor, given that it's 105 miles and none of us have done anything over 50 miles before. So we have a ways to go, but I'm excited to do it, to train for something and have a group of guys that want to do it with me. So that was called Rollins Pass. If anyone ever wants to look that up, it's pretty cool. And then last update here is that, man, resting heart rate and HRV are just something so interesting to me. And I'm still trying to figure out why sometimes they'll just like settle high. And for like 2 or 3 weeks, I'll be like resting heart rate at 46. And now for the last like 2 or 3 weeks, it's settled lower. And now my resting heart rate's like 37 or 38, almost like 10 points lower. And it does this sometimes. And I can't quite figure out the rhyme or reason for why it does it. But I'll go through, it's not even just like an acute bump where it's like, oh, I had an overtrained day or I didn't sleep well, so my heart rate is higher. It's like when it decides to be higher, it's higher for like a few weeks. And then when it's lower, it's like lower for a few weeks. And I don't like feel differently or anything. It's just kind of some weird stuff I can't quite figure out. I don't know if anyone else experiences the same thing, but like right now, I'm in a period of time where it's been low for 2 or 3 straight weeks. And every morning I wake up and it's in the high 30s and my HRV is insanely high as well, which I think is an important thing to note for people. I've mentioned on the podcast before, but I've had so many DMs about HRV and people inquisitive about it. And one thing that people don't even realize, I think, is that having a lower heart rate elicits a higher HRV in most cases. Because what you're doing in HRV is you're measuring the variability between heartbeats. And if your heart rate is racing really fast, like da-da-da-da-da-da-da, then there's inevitably going to be less distance between your heartbeats. Whereas if your heartbeat is boom, 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 then there's just inevitably going to be more microseconds of distance between each of those heartbeats. So as your heart rate is lower, your HRV goes higher. And I think most people don't understand that. So as we compare my HRV when my heart rate is 46 to where it is when my heart rate is 39, like nothing changes in the way I feel or in my breathing pattern or in anything. Like all of the variables are the same. I'm doing it at 6 a.m. on my couch in the same position, but the HRV will inevitably be higher when the heart rate is lower, and it will be lower when the heart rate is higher, even from 39 to 46 beats. So imagine if your heart rate is 60 and you're not like a super fit cardiovascular phenom, then you will inevitably have a lower HRV just because your resting heart rate is higher. So all that stuff like has a lot of interplay in between it, and I think it's super interesting. And I'll probably do a post on it at some point. We still probably should have someone on to discuss it in more detail. We've touched on this with Mike Nelson when he was on our podcast, Dr. Mike, maybe a little less than a year ago. But we probably should have someone on to like straight up discuss HRV and some of these intricacies that I'm intrigued about. Maybe Mike would even be a good guy to do that. And then the last thing on HRV is just I don't make training decisions based off of it. I let it guide me in a sense. And so there are times where my HRV is really poor, but I feel fine. And so I'm going to train because I'm going to ignore that the HRV told me it wasn't good. And I'm just going to say, I feel good and I'm going to train. And then there's other times, like, for example, yesterday, we just did this 3.5-hour bike ride on Sunday. So I woke up Monday and I had great HRV and great heart rate. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting that I biked for 3.5 hours in the mountains and I'm still getting all these great readings because I don't feel great. And so what I did in that case is I didn't work out immediately because I didn't feel like I wanted to. And as the day went on and I had some food and I got a walk in and I did some work and all that, I started to feel better. And so at that point, I decided to work out. And so I do think that ultimately your decision as to whether you honor what your heart rate and HRV numbers are saying and make decisions based off of that or not should probably be based more on the way you feel and using that HRV and heart rate data as just like some additional insight. But the way that you feel subjectively should be, the primary determinant of whether you work out.
I would love to play a little bit of devil's advocate.
Yep.
On that. And I'm not saying that I'm right or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm in a bit of like a slump, we can call it. I haven't been feeling great. I think I'm going through I get these periods in my life where I just feel emotionless, empty, like not bad emotions, not good emotions, but like there's just no emotions. Right. And I'm kind of crawling out of one of those now. And I really have to just like follow my structure and my schedule, or I just don't feel like doing anything. And I had a day where I almost didn't train. I think it was Saturday. I just felt like dog shit. Mood was just in the gutter. And I was like, no, go in, get your shit done. PRs, like good PRs, not like Aaron returning from hernia PRs, like even beating prior numbers PRs. And I was sitting there, I'm like, man, this is wild. Like I don't want to be here today. I'm in a pissy mood. And that has not impacted my performance like whatsoever. And I just found it really fascinating. And I often do find myself kind of conflicted with that because there's numerous times. And I think back to like when I was, when you still had the gym, the first time I put 315 over my head, I felt like dog shit. My shoulder was killing me. And my plan was to not even try to do the lifts because my shoulder hurt so bad and I felt like shit. And by far, it was one of my best overhead performances I've ever had. So I always find this thing like really interesting I do think it's a good proxy, but I think the word proxy is a good usage because it's not always like causative.
So you're saying subjectively you didn't feel like you wanted to work out, but you actually don't have like heart rate or HRV data to say whether maybe that was telling you like, hey, dude, you should go work out. Like you're in great shape right now. So yeah, no, I mean, I think that's why it's a multifactorial system. Like I love having the data because I can see the data, but I don't let that data affect me. It's like when the people use sleep apps and they see shitty sleep, but they thought they had good sleep. And then suddenly they have a really bad day because their app told them they had bad sleep. Like I don't let that affect me either. I wake up and I make a decision about how I slept, and then I look at my sleep app and I don't let that affect kind of how I live my day. And I think similarly, we can compare that to kind of what you mentioned as well, in that sometimes the way that you feel isn't always perfectly representative of what you're going to do in your implementation of it or whatever. So yeah, like I relate, I understand. I guess to push back and play one more thought experiment here. In situations like that, maybe not this specific one, but in the past, as you think through that, or this specific one, maybe, do you feel like you pay a price for going in and having this incredible performance and this monumental effort on a day where maybe you don't feel the best? Do you feel like there's a price to pay for the next 1, 2, 3, 4 days after that? Or is it just like you're riding high on this PR that you had and like everything now is suddenly better because you had this great training session?
So that's the thing, and that's why I really went in, because like I said, I've been in this kind of emotionless funk where like it was more so like, oh cool, I was able to progress, like I like that, but it didn't like change my day. I still had a crappy day. I still was like low mood, those sorts of things. But what I find is my feelings will lie, and I say this with clients all the time, like your feelings will lie to you at times, and that's why I really like the structure and the schedule. But if I would have went in and like, hey, I'm supposed to get 9 reps for, a rep improvement, and I get like 5, I'm like, okay, performance is piss poor. We're wasting our time here, and I would leave. But it's just not always like super cut and dry, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think for you and I, it's also interesting just looking at it from a higher level perspective, because you and I are both pretty low affect, where we both trend pretty neutral and we aren't very high and very low. And so like I relate, like I understand exactly what you're saying. In many times, I sometimes wish I had more of that emotional grit, or that emotional volatility even, because sometimes I wish that I could feel more and feel less, or feel more about certain things, like feel highs and feel lows, but I'm always in the neutral state. And so it is kind of hard to ascertain or kind of pick out why or how I might be feeling a certain way and whether that should in fact affect a decision that I make.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, what's going on with you?
Okay, so first, that is on top of my mind while it's here. I don't know if I already did this, but our cream of rice that we've been making over the however many months is up. Our web store is up, only in Indonesia for right now. But we have a product. So this we have here, so everyone on YouTube can see.
Nice.
It's pretty cool. It's very cool to see something come like full circle. And I'm very proud of it, as is everyone. And it's been what I really like is I know what's in it because I put it in there, and like did it also. I know there's no trust that has to go into anything. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is purely for my own selfish reasons because everyone has to like trust me, which I don't really like, but it's a tangible, which feels really, really cool. Like so far, everything business related has been, online, which is still, very real, of course, but it's less tangible than like holding something in my hands. So that's been cool. We unloaded our first gym order this past Tuesday that came in. It was a hellacious day. Let's just put it that way. It was just long manual labor, figuring things out on the fly, not being able to communicate with the like workers, which I mean, don't get me wrong, like it's time for me to learn Bahasa, which is Indonesian. But yeah, and there was numerous times where I literally thought to myself, like, these motherfuckers built the pyramids however many thousands of years ago, like we can figure this out. But I mean, it really felt like that. Like, and you have a new appreciation for how heavy some of these machines are with a calf raise. It has like a 400-pound stack or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And like about half of them were all about 125 kilos or up or heavier. The heaviest being the calf raise, which was 253 kilos, which is literally like well over 500 pounds.
Yeah, 556 or something. That's nuts.
Yeah, it was just hell to move. Absolute hell. So I'm very glad it's over. And then for the next order, the gym will just be far enough along where we can like use a forklift and like do things properly,
Nice.
at least to get it in, and then up the stairs we'll still have to do it. But an adventure for sure. It's just been an adventure.
Did you have to carry that calf machine up the stairs?
We did not get that one up the stairs. So like everything that was like under a certain threshold, we carried it up the stairs. And what we literally did was like everything, all the machines were like on a pallet, screwed into a pallet and like wrapped. Put rope through the corners of the pallet, and then would take like I think like a 2x4, but like a thicker, stronger version of that, and would like put that under the ropes, and then would like lift that.
Mm-hmm.
So like a guy on each corner, and then people like stabilizing it. But man, it was brutal, absolutely brutal. I came home just like exhausted and wiped out, and just like spent.
Yeah, I mean, you texted me and said we couldn't do the podcast, so like you know that you were worked.
Yeah, I came home. I had like 2 outstanding check-ins to do. I got up super early to like make sure I got all my check-ins done. I was almost able to get through all of them, and I came home. I like wrapped those up. I was like running on fumes, like showered and went. Yeah. So happy that's here and behind us, and the first one down. Now we'll have 2 more to do. I think that's it for me today.
Okay, sweet. Word up. Well, let's jump in. So there's this separated out into kind of 6 or 5 sections of kind of current topics that we want to discuss that seem to be top of mind in the evidence-based space. So the first one is training volume throughout training age. And so we've kind of touched on this one before, but I think it's productive and helpful for us to kind of go in and spend a little bit more time on it. So the general idea, I think, out there of training volume is that it just goes up as you increase in training age. I think most people would say that that's kind of the general trend of research is, hey, you become more trained, you need to do more training volume to continue to elicit the same response. But I don't think it quite works exactly like that. In fact, I don't think it works really like that at all. Because in the beginning, when you first start training, anything works. So in that case, yeah, you could start with 1 set per muscle group, and then your line might actually look like for a while it goes up. And I think that is sort of what happens up to the intermediate stage. So you can start training with 1 set per muscle group or 2 sets or whatever. And because you're brand new and because you have no stimulus from weight training in the past, that 1 set is going to produce some crazy good gains for you. And you'll get stronger, you'll hypertrophy. And at some point, that 1 set will likely stop working. And now you kind of begin to have to make some training decisions. Is it that you need to work harder? Do you need to work closer to failure? Do you need to do more volume? Do you need to do more volume and work closer to failure? Do you need to change exercise selection? I mean, there's a ton of variables that go into it, but focusing here strictly on volume, I think that the entrance into the intermediate stage is going to have you utilize more volume. And the reason that I think the intermediate stage has this response is because you now have sensitivity to the stimulus. You probably are not capable of going as muscle specific, and what's the word I'm looking for? As focused with your exercise execution as somebody who's advanced. So because your execution is now decent because you're an intermediate, but maybe not as precise as if you were advanced, you do need to do a bit more volume, and you can handle more volume because you're no longer that noob who is getting extreme DOMs from just a small amount of work. So I think intermediate stage starts somewhere between 6 months and 2 years, really depending on how dedicated you are to the craft. And so I'll hold off on advanced for a second and kick this over to you. But I think starting with a small amount of volume, it doesn't have to be one set, but something small in the beginning is probably a prudent move. And then as you kind of get into that 6 month to 2 year stage where you would be entering intermediate, the volume generally kicks up at that point. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it completely. To look at it from a slightly larger lens, I think I know we often speak about the novice, the beginner, the intermediate, the advanced in terms of like volume, and execution and stuff. What I also think is still very pertinent, but it's less hard to quantify, are the peripheral things in relation to training, how seriously you're like taking your diet, the priority of this in your life over like, hey, I'm always hitting my training sessions versus like, oh, I'm dating some girl now, I'm not going to go to the gym like for 2 weeks or something like that. Like I do think these things are very correlative with that training age. And it's really just like how important it becomes, to you. And typically with that, as you learn more, you start to explore a little bit. And that is typically goes with like, okay, now I'm going to do more because I enjoy it. Maybe I do want to spend more than 45 minutes training because I enjoy being here. For me personally, when I really kind of caught the bug of like loving it, I was just down to train for 2 hours because I was just happy to be there, So I do think that there's likely a few different variables that go into why your volume goes up, but it probably has to do with like enjoyment, exploration, some of those like peripheral things, instead of just like someone said, I'm an intermediate now, I should do more. It's likely a combination of things that influence that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'm glad you kind of brought it back to that, which brings up another thought in my mind, which is if someone has that incredible passion and love for being in the gym, do you think there is detriment or caution that they need to take if they're a novice, like straight beginner, and they're like, oh my God, I'm 2 weeks into the gym and I'm obsessed with it, and I know volume is so important, so now I'm going to go and I'm going to spend 2 hours in the gym 4 days a week, 5 days a week, but I'm only like 2 weeks into training, but I've caught the bug,
The people who are like that, right? They're either going to be your oh my goodness, Jay Cutler, the Anton dude who just turned pro at 19 years old, like the first 19-year-old IFBB pro in however many years or whatever. Or they're going to be that person who's has the attention span of like a goldfish, who's like, I'm crazy into training now, and they're all about it for like 3 weeks, and then
they burn out.
They never lift again in their entire life, sort of thing. So I think you kind of go one of two ways. More likely than not, the latter, obviously, but I think if you're super new into it, you can't get enough quality information in such a short time period for that, I would say, to be actually impactful or detrimental.
Yeah, that's interesting. And even if they are doing a ton of volume as a brand new novice, it's likely that the majority of that volume isn't even like super stimulative. They're just moving weight from point A to point B. They're not really like targeting the specific muscles. Exercise selection's probably all over the place. It's probably unlikely that they're working close to failure, because if you're doing a ton of sets as you just begin, like the response you're going to get is crippling soreness, and you're probably not going to do that again. So I do think there's some kind of like intrinsic lessons there that apply more globally across the board. But this does kind of bring me into the next part of volume throughout training age, which is that volume differs based on a number of factors. Exercise selection being a very obvious one. So saying that I do 12 sets for my quads, it's very different to be doing 6 sets of leg press and 6 sets of hack squats versus 7, 8 sets of leg extensions and 2 sets of hack squats, or 4 sets of hack squats, or whatever that is. I mean, that volume is not equal. And then other volume that's not equal is how close you are to failure. So imagine somebody's like, yeah, I'm doing 25 sets a week, but they're doing all leg extensions to 5 RIR or something like that. Like, that's an extreme example that nobody would actually do because 25 sets of leg extensions is absurd. But just for this thought experiment, whether you train to failure or not train to failure and which exercises you're choosing all change the stimulus that your quads receive from what you're doing. And so that's where, like, I don't love the conversation when these people DM me and they say, well, how much volume should I be doing? I'm doing 6 to 10 sets right now. Should I be doing more? And I'm like, what does your volume look like? Like, I can't answer that question for you. Like, are you getting sore? Are you getting a pump? Are you progressing? Like, those are probably more important questions than how much volume you're actually doing. So yeah, anything to kind of add to that thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the golden question that people don't really want to talk about, is unfortunately, and I really wish this wasn't the case. Like, the answer, like you said, it's not a simple answer. It's not 4 sets per week. It's not 6 sets per week. You know, it really does depend, especially once we get into kind of the next little section in terms of like exercise execution, right? You take like someone who has really developed like quads, who's, you know, built to squat or something like that, the amount of stimulus in probably CNS, like overstimulation or fatigue that they can induce on like one set of hack squats to the house is probably 10x what that novice could do on a hack squat. You know what I mean? And it just doesn't translate. It's not a one-to-one. There's so many factors that go into it. And the unfortunate I mean, even across, I know we talked about this on a couple episodes ago, the design of the hack squat. If you have like a really well-designed hack squat where you can sit on your heels ass to grass and get that great stretch, that's different than one that's going to force it to be much more like hip driven. Like, there's just so many variables, and it really is important to truly help someone, or if you're asking someone a question, give them context as much as possible that's pertinent, because it really, really does depend.
Yeah, for sure. And then that kind of allows us to tie a bow on this and kind of progress into the advanced trainee. So we have this curve where volume can start low as a beginner or novice because everything works and you're just kind of learning stuff. There's a point where you kind of progress into intermediate where you want to refine technique, and refining technique requires you to do more because the repetition and just doing it over and over is going to help you become better at doing it. Plus, you've gotten through all the crazy DOMs from the newbie stage. So now as an intermediate, your volume is going up. Regardless of exercise selection, I think volume is going up. And then we kind of get to this point where we're late intermediate and we kind of get into this early advanced stage. And this is where I begin to generally see volume trend down from where it was peaked in the intermediate stage. And the reason for this is better exercise execution, so you can just create more stimulus to the muscle with less work. You're generally better at assessing RIR and failure. So if you're the type of person that wants to actually go to failure and or train close to failure, 1 RIR, I would say the same, then you won't need as much work there because you're actually dialed in and you know how to get there. And I feel like there's another reason why volume goes down as an advanced trainee, but those are certainly like the 2 most prominent ones off the top of my head.
The one that I really like to use, and the one that I find most pertinent in my personal own life, is performance. A set, let's say, for example, you know, set 1, let's talk like a cable chest supported like high row or something like that. And I'll make really simple examples, like set 1, 100 pounds, I get like 11 reps. That's a really, really good set. Set 2, I get like 7, almost can lock 8, but can't, right? That's a 3, 4, effectively 4 rep drop off, pretty significant. I go into a third set, I get maybe 5, maybe 6. I don't need that third set, right? Because like it's just such a large performance drop off that it's probably not overly stimulative. You're probably kind of maxed out from at that kind of threshold of at that heavier load. And that's one where if I know I can't, if I'm getting that kind of stark drop off, I just don't perform that set. What I could probably do is maybe put one extra set in of an additional exercise or something like that, or I really just don't need the extra volume. And unfortunately, that's something that you're going to have to kind of uncover a little bit about yourself. And I do think different periodizations of nutrition come into play. If you're using an intra workout, if you're dieting, if you're super high calories, like there's other facets at play there. But performance is one that I really like to lever because it's typically pretty indicative of things. If performance is great, okay, great. Maybe we test out an additional set or something like that. If performance starkly declines, I probably don't need that set.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's actually, so our final section is the impact of training to failure, and rep performance and rep drop off are part of the things I include in there. So we'll get back to that at the end.
Perfect.
I do want to take one small tangent on what you're saying and just ask, because the general perception in the space is that if volume is lower, you're likely going to see strength increases or performance increase more because fatigue is lower. The devil's advocate argument to that for someone doing hypertrophy is that we don't really care if your performance is improving that much because volume is going to be more of a prominent driver of hypertrophy than strength increases. So there's obviously a point where the volume is too low, but where is that point? Like if I'm doing one set a week per muscle group and I'm getting progress for many, many weeks in a row, and I'm like, I'm going up a rep here, I'm adding 5 pounds here, I'm increasing, blah, 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 but I'm only doing one set per muscle group per week. Like, am I cool because performance is going up, or should I be doing more volume, which may actually impact performance negatively? And so how do we square that circle?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point to bring up. I think this is where some of those kind of volume landmarks can probably come into play. And there's probably, let's call it like there's probably like a 5 sets per week. I would say like a minimum, I don't
arbitrarily without knowing failure or exercise selection or like
an arbitrary minimum. It's just really, really hard, because like I say that I'm not doing 5 sets per week on my biceps and they're fucking growing. Like they're growing more than I want them to grow, like it's not super cut and dry. And I hate that answer, but that's like me being truthful and honest. It's just not. And like, but at the same time, my quads, which are like the thing that I want to grow the most, like I'm like, I got to find another way to put some sets in on another day, because the dichotomy of Aaron's physique to his quads is only getting worse now. And I don't want that to happen, but like what I'm doing is not sufficient for them to grow at the rate that the rest of my body is. So it's just, even within yourself, it's going to vary, which is even more frustrating.
Like if you were just following performance, you might just do one set of hack squats because maybe that allows you to be so recovered in your quads that you can improve performance week on week. But does doing one set of hack squats at 20 pounds heavier than you were doing one set of hack squats means that your quads grew as much as they would have grown if you were doing more work, but maybe only increased 10 or 15 pounds? It's definitely a mind fuck. So I just wanted to throw that out there as, always important to think about the other side of the situation.
Yeah, a great point to bring up.
All right, cool. So the next one we have is maintenance volume. And this one has been interesting to me recently since the data-driven guys came out with a podcast a few weeks ago on maintenance volume. And the reason that it's interesting is because when you look at the 2 studies that are really out there on maintenance volume, one shows, well, they both kind of show somewhere between a third and a ninth of the volume that it took to build is kind of what it takes to maintain. The group that was able to maintain on a ninth of the volume was young, And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind as we think about like muscle protein synthesis and how that changes over training age. You want to jump in and say something on that?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
Do you know how young, or is young in this context
I
approximately?
want to say it was college age kids. And then the group that took a third of the volume to maintain was more like 40s, I want to say. I'm repeating what I thought I heard in the podcast. I haven't read this study in a while.
Okay. Yeah, the reason I asked was like, I wonder if it was the young crowd just has a lot less muscle, so you need much less work to maintain. But I can't say that I would confidently say that the difference of muscle mass between college, university age to 40 would be that
I think it's training
to
age.
warrant that.
No,
Okay.
it's a great point because I think training age is the factor here that I was going to kind of double click on. Because if you're relatively new to training, just because you're in your 20s doesn't mean you have less muscle mass at base than someone in their 40s. But if you're brand new to training, which would be more likely when you're young versus when you're older, then it is likely that less would maintain. So say you go from not training at all, and then you're going to 9 sets a week, which I think is what the study did. So you have 9 sets a week, work sets, and you went from nothing to 9 sets. So your body still, in some ways, is still used to doing nothing. Even if you've done 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks of this training study, the prior 20 years of your life was nothing. So these 12 weeks are just a microcosm in the grand scheme of what your body is used to doing. So when you drop from 9 sets down to 1 set, it's like, hey, you're still doing more than you were doing for the last 20 years of your life. So I think that certainly can play one factor. As far as the older group that needed a third of the dose, I think that also, like, I'm not sure, but I don't think these people were trained either. So it could literally just be a factor of muscle protein synthesis, synthetic response that's requiring the older people to do a bit more volume. But I also, so this is one of the points that the data-driven guys brought up that I thought was really good, is just like, how long were these studies where they cut their volume back? Because it's possible that these guys could be maintaining their gains for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. But what about like 3 years from now? If you're cutting your volume from 9 sets down to 1 set and you just keep doing 1 set in perpetuity, like, do you expect that you're still going to maintain all of the gains that you made during 9 sets by doing 1? Or for the older group, do you think by doing 3 sets compared to 9 that you're going to be able to maintain that forever? And we don't know the answer to that either from that study because everything is short term.
Yeah. I wonder if we'll ever get an answer out of that. I mean, my theory, which could be complete garbage, by the way, is that the diminishment would be so small and so slow, you wouldn't be able to notice it except over like a year-long period or something like that. And it's just like these micro, regressions that you don't notice until enough time has passed.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think they used ultrasound for this study, for one of the studies. And I think what Josh was saying was something that the margin of error was like larger than the possibility of error was larger than what the actual difference in muscle mass was. So like, we're talking about guys that have like you go from training not at all to 9 sets. And so you get some change, which you can see. And then when you drop it down to 1 set, there's even less change. And so it might show that it's a few millimeters or whatever, but that's within the margin of error. So it could just be like the machine was errored, right? And so we say, yeah, it's very difficult to ascertain a whole lot from that. And so where we kind of go with this, like practically, I think is almost more important than talking about studies here, is like, what do we do with clients and what do we do with ourselves during a period of time, and what do we notice? And so, man, and again, like before I even say anything further, I think it's important to state that proximity to failure and exercise selection and intent, your ability to manifest stimulus in your movements, like all of these things are so relevant when we talk about training volume. So you can't just nominally say like, I was doing 9 sets and now I'm doing 3 sets, because there's so many factors that go into that. What if you're doing 9 sets of leg extensions and now you're doing 3 sets of hack squats? Like that, to me, like I don't know, if I'm doing 3 sets of hack squats and I was doing 9 sets of leg extensions, I'd be surprised if there was any lost muscle. I might actually think I would gain muscle with 3 sets of hack squats compared to 9 sets of leg extensions. So exercise selection and proximity to failure are perpetually tied together in this situation, and we can't just separate them out.
You are 100% correct. And my kind of final tidbit on this particular section that we're talking about is, what's the reason that your maintenance volume, that you're training at a maintenance volume? It's likely a practical reason for life. Maybe it's a big priority on work in your career, or maybe it's you're a stay-at-home mom with like your 3 kids or whatever. But regardless, if you're like, oh, Aaron, I can only train 2 times per week, like, does that mean I'm going to lose some muscle? And I'm like, wait, potentially, but what is our alternative? Is Jesus Christ, our alternative is like training 3 times per week. And that person might be like, well, I can't stick to that. And I'm like, okay, well, this is the reality of what we have. So maybe 2 times per week is what we do. And you may lose some muscle mass, but that's just an acceptance of this particular stretch of your life. And when it's over, you can go back to a higher frequency, a higher volume, and reclaim that lost tissue. But it's like, regardless, like, if you train as much as your schedule allows or your enjoyment allows, and you might just be in a pinch where you can't, and you might lose some muscle mass, and that's just the factor of that reality, and that's okay.
Yeah. Last thing on maintenance volume here is the thought experiment as to whether maintenance volume is a factor of absolute volume or a percentage of total volume. And so what I mean by that is, say someone's doing 30 sets and they drop down to 10 sets because that's a third of the volume. That is one thing. I mean, they're still doing 10 sets of volume per week. Even though they drop 20 sets, they're still doing 10. Versus if you take somebody that was doing 12 sets and they drop down to 4, they're also doing a third of the volume that they were doing, and they actually only dropped 8 sets. So in some ways, you could argue that the 12 to 4 person is doing more because they dropped fewer total sets. But when you look at the absolute amount of volume that's being done, the person that dropped from 30 to 10, even though they dropped 20 sets, they're doing an absolutely larger amount of total volume. So where would you stand on kind of looking at that equation, on which one you think would be more productive?
More productive or less detrimental?
However we want to frame it is fine. Yeah, which would be less detrimental probably?
Man, I would say the former, the person going from 30 to 10, I would say would probably be less detrimental, but not for the reasons that you would think. I think the reason it would be less detrimental is you're going from 30 sets to 10 sets, you're probably going to be getting much better sets. Because I'll eat my words, sure. Show me someone who's doing like 30 really high quality sets for a muscle group per week. They're probably like an IFBB pro or something like that. And then I'm like, okay, yeah, they are. But outside of that context, a lot of it's probably kind of shitty and not great. And if we just chop off a lot of the shitty, not great, and just get back to like a 10 sets per week baseline of like high quality work, it's probably probably much less detrimental to the person who's already doing a lot of quality work, but slashing it by 60% or 66% or whatever.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I think that there is something to absolute volume, even though there's all those contextual pieces that we talked about with proximity to failure and exercise selection and effort and all that stuff. But yeah, I do think the absolute amount of volume probably does matter. And so somebody dropping from 30 to 10 likely will maintain muscle better than someone dropping from 12 to 4. And that would just be my kind of overriding thought on that.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to rest periods. So I think all of these things have interplays together, right? Like when we talk about training volume, we can't separate training volume from proximity to failure any more than we can separate it from how long you're resting between sets. And so when we look at these examples we've used before, say we have somebody doing 30 sets, but they're resting 30 seconds or a minute between sets, then we already know that the majority of those sets are going to be less effective than they would be if we were resting longer. So I think that certainly has, very relevant impact on total volume loads. And another one of those factors when we talk about like someone says, hey, I'm doing this many sets. It's like, but how about rest periods? Like, how are you recovering between your sets and all that? And then how that will actually ultimately play into rep drop off, which we're going to get to in the impact of failure in the final section. But I think ultimately when it comes to rest periods, like the research is starting to change its tune. And I think that's why I included it in this segment here, because a couple of years ago, all the research was showing that 2 to 3 minutes was superior to 1 minute. We covered this in one of I think it's in the nihilism episode that I did, episode 100. We talked about rest periods and kind of some of the data at that time. And definitely 2 to 3 minutes was shown superior to 1 minute in pretty much a couple studies across the board. I think Krieger did a cool analysis of that, James Krieger. But it definitely like has an impact into how we construct our routine. So during this period, I think what we should do is discuss practically how we would arrange a routine with varying rest periods, if that's something that we include. For example, straight sets as well as rest pause or drop sets and things like that, as well as how this may or may not impact our decision making with compounds and isolations. So if you want to kick that off with any initial thoughts you have on that.
Yeah. So one initial thought that I think doesn't get talked about enough is your cardiovascular, output and ability. Like, for example, Brian and I are training together and doing, Bulgarian split squats. Brian's going to be ready for his set much faster than I will because Brian's in much better cardiovascular shape than me, So understanding where you kind of are in that spectrum, it's often typically correlated with how large of a person you are and that sort of thing as well. But I think that plays a pretty large role. So if you're in really good shape and, maybe you're training 3 times per week because you know that you should, but you're just very, very fit, you're going to be ready and recovered much faster than someone like myself who, I'm just not that fit, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I think if left to just a very polarized look at rest periods, I think my intuition would say to take longer rest periods and do straight sets. But not everybody has 2 hours a day to train. And it also is likely a different response, whether we're talking about isolation movements that are significantly less fatiguing or demanding compound movements like Aaron mentioned with the split squat or a pendulum or a hack or RDL, something along those lines. And so what I've found myself doing as we've had more of this research come out regarding rest periods is that I've began using straight sets with longer rest periods for those big demanding compound movements, just resting until I'm ready, which is it could be 2 to 3 minutes between legs on a split squat, or it could be 3 to 5 minutes between sets of like a hack squat or something like that. And then saving time on the isolation movements, especially short overload isolation movements. So talking about like, dumbbell lateral raise variations, different curl variations, tricep press downs, leg extensions, leg curls, things like that. I tend to use shorter rest periods and use more things like rest pause sets and drop sets and stuff like that. Because at the moment, when we look at the research, it is beginning to show that using shorter rest periods is not a problem, but that you do need to sort of increase volume to compensate for the shorter rest period. So for example, something like a leg extension, you could do 3 sets straight of leg extensions where you're resting 2 to 3 minutes between sets, and boom, you get a bunch of really good quality leg extension reps, you get some effective reps, you get 3 sets close to failure, all's good. Or according to the research, you could do 1 set of leg extensions close to failure and then just rest 15 or 20 seconds between each of your next sets. But instead of doing 3 total sets, you now have to do 5 total sets. So you have that initial buy-in set and then you have 4 more sets, but they're all with like really short rest. And if you extrapolate out the total time that you're spending on the leg extensions from doing 3 straight sets with full rest compared to one set with 4 short rest sets, you are going to save time doing the short rest leg extension work. Not a ton, like it's not as much as people think because you do have to do more sets. But resting 20 seconds between sets is way less than resting 2 to 3 minutes. And so you're able to make up a lot of that time there. And for a lot of people, it's just a nice way to change training up too. So even if it's not about saving time, it's like, hey, look, I have this movement where I'm locked in. The only thing bending on my whole body is my knees. Like I'm bending my knees, I'm straightening my knees. I'm bending my knees, I'm straightening my knees. Like the fatigue cost is going to be significantly less than it's going to be across other movements. Maybe we take advantage of that and we use some of these short rest sequences. And in reality, I'm less likely to use that on a leg extension because it's still a lower body movement and it's still quite demanding. But on an upper body movement, I almost exclusively find myself using some of these short rest sequences now, just because the stimulus is great, you get it done in less time, and the studies don't seem to show that there's any detriment to approaching it that way. So I know you don't generally do that, but I do know you include some of that stuff with clients, right?
Yeah, it depends. So like right now I have none of it because I just want and this was just what I thought in my head. I'm not saying it's the best way or correct. It was like, I want to get my training performance back to where it is with a lower volume, and then I'll start sprinkling these things in. So that was just my thought process. But one thing that I think could be beneficial here, and I think this is the last part on this, and then we'll move on, is some of these like shorter rest sequences. It trains you, or you're training your body to push through some of the inadvertent discomfort that comes up. So like when you're just doing straight sets on the leg extension, like you're never really having to deal with like that burn or like your body telling you like, put it down, end it here, but you know you can keep going. But when you are doing some of these like incomplete rest methods or something like that, you're going to have that lactate accumulation, and you can like, it's a skill to push through that and just keep like your mind locked in. And if you're only ever doing straight sets, like you'll never be able to, you'll never be offered the opportunity to really learn at that level to push through there, because you just never be presented with it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it also makes me think of kind of the slight difference between drop sets and rest pause sets. Because I think when you do a drop set, you're more likely to fail mentally than you are with a rest pause set. Because in a drop set, say you have 100 pounds on the leg extension and you get 8 reps, and then you drop it to 70 and you keep going, or 60 or whatever, you're going to get another 8 reps or another 10 reps. So you're going to have to basically do all these kind of easier buy-in reps that are just creating lactate and burning your quads so bad in a leg extension that you might fail mentally before you actually get to the really important true physical failure, just because it burns so bad. Whereas when you do a rest pause set, which is essentially rest 20 seconds and then do another set, but keep the weight the same, so you're not actually decreasing the weight. I think on a rest pause set, you're more likely to be able to get those really effective reps initially, because if I start with a leg extension set of 8 reps as a buy-in and then I rest 20 seconds, I'm probably doing 3. And 3 is like failure at that point. And then I'll rest another 20 seconds and I'll get 2, which is way way less daunting mentally than having to go through those easy reps because you decided to drop the weight just to get back to the higher reps. So in exercises that have a high level of mental fatigue, given the burn associated, I will often find myself programming rest pause set instead of drop set.
Yeah. I would say I use the rest pause much more frequently than the drop set, because there's also the mental component that you're moved. How much do I drop? Did I drop too little? Did I drop too much? Like right. It's another aspect that comes into it. When you're not changing the weight, it's a simpler, or it's something with less variables.
Yep, for sure. All right, 2 sections to go. Frequency is next. And so I have some thoughts on all of this, but the first question I want to pose to you from the nutrition side is, do you have any insight into muscle protein synthetic response throughout training age, as far as whether it decreases as you become higher trained?
The only thing that I feel confident in saying that I think could be beneficial to the conversation is our efficiency at muscle protein synthesis as we age gets worse. Right. So we need more protein. Now that's me extrapolating age to training age, which is typically correlative, but not not causative necessarily. But in terms of it, all things being equal, protein intake being high enough, do I know if it's shorter? I do not confidently. I can't confidently say that. No.
What if we throw out this hypothetical thought experiment where there's a 24-year-old bodybuilder, and this bodybuilder started training at 15 and he's been dedicated hardcore, say he's like a competitive bodybuilder at this point at 24, versus somebody who's 24 and is just starting training? Like, do we feel confident enough to say that that person at 24 who has 9 years of training age probably has a slightly diminished MPS response to training as compared to the person that's just starting training at the same age?
From an absolute level or like relative to work done? I would say relative to work done, lower. Yeah.
So, I think from my understanding, and this is definitely not like a very thorough read of the research, but what I understand is that as you start training, you're brand new to training, that you generally get at least 72 hours of elevated MPS after a training session. I think that number goes down to 24 hours or even less than 24 hours as you become well-trained, call it to the intermediate or advanced stage. And I would have to go find research to support this. I just that's kind of the common sentiment that I hear amongst the industry at the moment.
The most recent time I remember hearing this is 48 hours MPS is peaked. And where I contextually remember that is that was the argument with the cold plunges of when to time them is MPS is highest, peaks 48 hours post a training session.
Was that specific to somebody that was trained or untrained, or we just don't know?
I don't remember. Yeah.
So I'm going to operate on what I said, which I don't know if is fully right, but say it's 72 hours for someone that's novice and it's 24-ish hours for somebody that's not. So we'll just say that it's diminished. We don't know how much it's diminished, but the fact that you're trained diminishes it in some capacity. Just because there's going to be less stimulus, less muscle damage, less a number of these factors that are going to require your body to elicit a higher level of MPS, right? And so the reason I wanted to frame it that way is because as we've talked about in the prior few episodes with Paul Carter and Chris Beardsley now on this kick of higher frequency training being necessary, the majority of their argument, I think, is based around muscle protein synthesis and how it likely decreases as training age increases. And so if before you could get MPS response that lasts 72 hours, then now you're looking at basically half the week. So you could train a muscle twice a week and you'd be maxed out on MPS for half the week, and then you train it again and you're maxed out for another half the week. So I think that their argument there is that as we now have this MPS response that only lasts 24 or say 48 hours, that training a muscle 3 times a week now becomes significantly more important than it was when your MPS response was higher. And I don't, like I said, I don't know if that's true. That seems to be the argument and the frame that they're coming from. Somebody can correct me if I'm misinterpreting this. But that's my understanding, and that's kind of the argument for why frequency might need to increase with training age. What do you think on that?
My only argument against it really comes from like a practical standpoint, right? If we're talking chest, lats, upper back, biceps, triceps, quads, glutes, hams, like programming each of those muscles 3 times per week. I mean, I think it can be done. It's not trivial, and I feel like we'd be running into a lot of like overlapping issues of this isn't recover. I mean, to me, it sounds like a pretty complex problem, right? That doesn't turn into a very generic full body training program, and I think my, again, argument against that is like, we're talking like advanced trainees, higher training age. How many very advanced trainees, higher training age with like really great physiques are just doing generic full body training programs?
Right.
I know very little. And this is I might be kind of straw manning. I believe that's the term there, that argument. I'm not, completely saying it's wrong. I just don't see it in the real world. And that it does seem like a very complex training. Like weaving that together sounds very complicated to me.
Yeah. My issue is with full body training has always been the overlapping fatigue. And so I do think there's a lot of self-awareness that needs to go into creating a program like that. And so I wouldn't feel super comfortable putting out like a generic program of, this is the optimal way to train as an advanced trainee 3 times a week, full body. Like it may be for some people. I think another thing that is often lost in that discussion is that so they're assuming that Chris Beardley and Paul, I guess, and I could be again misstating their stance here, but it seems like they're looking at it on like an individual muscle level. So it's like if I train my chest on Monday, then the MPS response to my chest is diminished by Wednesday, and therefore I must train my chest again on Wednesday. Whereas I wonder how much of this is actually explained by just whole body stimulus. So like, what if you're following a bro split, to use an extreme example, and you have like a chest day on one day, and then you have another day that's triceps and shoulders. And so on the triceps and shoulders day, you're getting more pushing volume in. You're doing maybe some steep incline pressing. You're getting a bit of upper chest. Maybe you're doing some dips or some like tricep push-ups. So you're getting a little bit of mid-lower chest through those movements. So now suddenly we've actually trained chest twice a week, even though it's only being hit once as like a primary muscle group. But one would think that that second session that you're doing is still providing a sufficient stimulus to the chest that its individual MPS response would be stimulated again, even though that's not like the direct pursuit of that session. And you get that even more with other muscle groups, like say your delts. Like if you're training chest, you're hitting delts. If you're training back, you're hitting delts. If you're training delts, you're hitting delts. Like, I mean, there's like, you can hit delts multiple times throughout the week without having to necessarily train full body each of those days. And so I just wonder, as we extrapolate this out, how much of the MPS response is individual to the muscle group and how much of it is just whole body stimulus of you're putting the body under load and resistance here.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know, right? I really, really don't. And this is an area where I'm sure the listeners can tell by my answers. Like I'm not making any strong kind of statements because I really don't know. But it's hard for me to see it actually all work out, because I think different muscles are going to have different rates of recovery. Like we just talked about the delts. You could train the delts probably every single day. I mean, maybe not like 7 days, but probably like a solid 5 days per week and be perfectly fine from a recovery standpoint. But it really comes into the balance of available time, schedule, balancing these different things, having different muscle groups recover at different rates because X percentage of your volume is lengthen bias with an eccentric focus. How much of it is short overload bias? I mean, it gets, the number of variables is astronomical that can go into this.
Yep. Are you here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that ties a bow pretty well onto frequency there. And then the last question I'll just leave people with, and we won't answer it now, but could one volume be maintenance while the same volume with a different frequency could be progress? And the example there would be, could you do 9 sets a week of chest on Monday and have that be maintenance? But if you split that into 3 sets on Monday, 3 sets on Wednesday, and 3 sets on Friday, suddenly due to this MPS response or whatever other factors out there, that suddenly now we're making progress by doing the same weekly volume just because it's split up differently. And so we won't address that right now, but I think it's some stuff to think on, ruminate on a little bit.
Yeah, definitely a very good question to think about.
All right. And then the last section here, impact of failure on all of the above. So it's basically a discussion on failure, but then we can kind of tie in some of the other stuff that we've already discussed. And so the first question is, how important is failure globally? And I don't think that failure globally is a requirement, but it certainly is a mechanism by which we can save time and a great way of calibrating effort to make sure that you are, in fact, putting in enough effort to make gains there. What are your thoughts on failure globally?
I think failure is very important. I think it's very important to know where failure is so that you can reasonably gauge against it. Because if you do not know what failure is, I guarantee you are, what's the word? Sandbagging yourself, right? Like if you've never taken a set of leg extensions to failure, you're going to be like, okay, here's, 60 pounds, 8 reps. I think that's 2 reps shy of failure. But if I'm there telling you more, that 8 reps turns into like 17 reps. And I cannot tell you how many times I have seen this in person where I'm standing there saying more again, because they're not there yet. And what they thought was a failure at 8 reps, they have more than doubled the reps, all good, clean reps. So I think it's very important to know where failure actually is so that you can pedal from there and know what it feels like and what that actual true 3 RIR, 2 RIR, whatever it is indeed accurate. That's the importance of it.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. So that's failure globally. My most interesting aspect of failure, and the thing I really want to get kind of some discussion going on here, is the implication of failure in earlier sets and how that affects the remainder of your session's performance. And so an example would be you take your first set of hack squats to the house and you go to failure and say you get 11 reps. And then you mentioned this earlier, you're pretty fatigued, you worked your ass off, and now you only get 8 reps on your next set, and then your third set you get 6. So 11, 8, and 6 is 25 total reps. Whereas if you would have just done 9 on the first set, then you probably could have gotten 9 on the second set and 9 on the third set. And now you've done a total of 27 total reps, but possibly only your last set was to failure, versus in the other approach, you took all 3 sets to failure. You got 2 less reps, but you potentially got more effective reps because all your sets were to failure. Every single rep that you did there was effective. So there's that aspect to consider. And so I have another thing to add on top of that, but what do you think about that proposition there?
Yeah, and I have a very unscientific answer, and I'm completely aware I might be in the minority here. I am just of the belief. I really like the example that you use, right? I think it's a perfect example in the way you phrased it or laid it out. I'm of the belief that if you're performing the same amount of reps on the third set that you are on your first set, that you're shortchanging yourself. And I just feel confident. Again, this is at least for my own life, not trying as hard as I possibly can at something that I want really, really badly never seems like a better way to get where I want than trying as hard as I can at something. And again, I said it's completely unscientific, but I think back to like a sports coach or a practice or something like that. And the coach is like sprinting you guys and you're taking it at 80%. And the coach is like, why the fuck are you not trying as hard as you can? And you're like, coach, because we're going to run 6 of them and I want to be able to give it my all on the last one. Like, you would get your ass kicked by the coach if you said that, across any sport. I don't care if that's American football, like soccer, basketball, anything. But in this like context and weight training, that's the answer that we give. So again, it's just hard for me to believe and to incorporate it into my life. And I get that, the research is typically indicative of that. It's just hard for me to believe, to be completely honest.
I would have probably agreed with you in the past, but ever since I've gotten into this cardio adventure and I've gone down the rabbit hole of practically implementing cardio, but also reading the research on cardio, and this idea of sustained effort across intervals, which I think interval training cardio is similar as you're going to get to weight training. Like, you can't compare zone 2 to weight training, but when you're talking about intervals, you're working hard for a short amount of time, then you're resting, you're recovering. It's much more similar to weight training. All the data seems to show that not blowing your load on the first interval is better than blowing your load and then trying to just tread water and survive for the remaining intervals.
I agree. I agree. I think there's specific context. Like that one is a perfect example. Powerlifting as well. If strength is the goal, we know that that's very, very correlative there. I think the strength one is interesting. I feel like that's a very close proximity. Yep. The cardio one, I think, is more of it's the game of cardio is they're duration based, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the only volume, cardio, it's a volume kind of game. The only short cardio is like 100-meter sprint, which is, whatever, 9 seconds or something like that. So I love that you brought that up because that is a really, really good point. But that's the
powerlifting's a good example though.
It's like the antithesis of what I said. And we know that if you train too close to failure, like the adaptations just don't happen like they would otherwise.
Well, I think the other devil's advocate argument against what you were saying is that with the predominance of research now on the highly demanding compound movements that are done for sets of 8 reps or less, 10 reps or less, something like that there seems to not be a difference in response, whether you go to failure or you stop, a couple reps shy. And man, it's tough. Like one side of me believes that if I go 999 and that last set is to failure, that I'm still creating the stimulus that my body needs for adaptation, and probably with less fatigue, because the 11-8-6 example of hack squat where every set is to failure, that leaves you so cached that like how high can the quality the rest of your session be? And so my kind of view on failure, especially as it pertains to the bird's eye view of the session, is that if I have a number of exercises for the same muscle group to do, I'm likely to more take that approach where it goes 999, where just the last set is to failure, because I know then I need to go to leg extensions and then I need to go to split squats or whatever it is. Whereas if I'm doing a different style of training routine, call it like a full body or some sort of split where it's just one exercise for a muscle group, like I'm doing hack squats and then that's it for quads, then I'm more likely to take your approach where I'm going to get everything I can out of each set that I have to offer, because I know that that's the end of my quad work, versus having these additional exercises that are kind of looming in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. It's almost like a never-ending argument, because then what the next logical phase of the argument is, well, why do you need 3 sets on the leg extension, or not the leg extension, the pendulum or whatever,
yeah.
Right? Why wouldn't we just put 2 of those sets on another day, and then we could take all four of the sets fair? Like it's like a seemingly never-ending loop of the conversation. And the honest reality is, like, we just don't know, And what I kind of defer to, which is in a very unscientific way, I understand that. What is the goal in the context? Are we speaking about hypertrophy? Sure. What do the people with the best physiques in the world do? Natural or not, or enhanced or whatever. They typically are not leaving 3 reps in the tank on their compounds. And it's like, I will look for some evidence there, and that could be, it could be we're all just brainwashed, and this is what we do because that's what some people did, and then it, follows through, and maybe in 30 years, the best physiques in the world won't train like that, but we don't have very, very conclusive evidence that's also rooted in practical real world examples of people at the top doing that. So that's where I feel conflicted about it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't know the answer either. I think this conversation is great, and playing devil's advocate to each other's points is super thought-provoking. So I am 10 minutes late on my child duty here to get these kids off to school. So I think this is a good point to wrap it up. And then we'll be back next week.
Yep. As always, guys, thank you for listening. I love this episode. I think we did a great job. Not to pat ourselves on the back, but playing devil's advocate on each other, I think, is very, very important and thought-provoking, like you said. So thank you as always, Brian. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll talk to you next week.